The year 1953 was special, one in which two times seemed to mix: pre-war silence and post-war anxiety. People lived as best they could, rebuilding houses, shifting bricks on the ashes, dragging rubble, as if this was not only a job, but also a cleansing of the soul from what had happened. In a village near Moscow, small but noisy from factory horns, there was a new brick house with a long staircase and fresh plaster, but underneath it was an old foundation, the foundation of a pre-revolutionary hospital destroyed during the Civil War. No one really remembered what happened at this place except for the old men, but they also spoke reluctantly, only waved their hands. They say, "You shouldn't build there, you shouldn't disturb the land." No one paid any attention to it then. After the war, they built quickly, regardless of where the cemetery was, where the ruins were, or where the foundation of someone's troubles was. When the house was ready, it was not occupied for a long time. At first, they waited for the commission, then for documents, then for alleged repairs, but each time there were reasons to postpone entry. And only a year later, the family of engineer Gromov moved in. An ordinary man, a veteran who returned without a leg, but with a clear mind and a steady hand. With him was his wife, a quiet, slightly sickly woman with a shadow of fatigue under her eyes, and his son, a boy of about 7, thin, with big eyes that seemed too old for his age. They got an apartment on the second floor, a corner one with windows overlooking a vacant lot and a forest edge. The house stood a little apart from the other buildings, as if it had isolated itself from the whole world. In the evening, its facade seemed darker than the neighbors, although the plaster was the same. People were joking. The house didn't take root, but they preferred not to come close anymore. There was only one feature of the Gromovs' apartment. There was a strange window in the boys' room, above the radiator. From the outside, it looked like all the others. A wooden frame for glass sections painted white, but in daylight the glass reflected nothing. There was no sun, no clouds, no faces, as if there was no depth or surface to it. It didn't sparkle, it didn't cast a shadow, it just absorbed everything that fell on it. The boy immediately said that he didn't like this window, but his father waved it off. "It's just old glass. Then we'll replace it." Only it was not possible to replace it. At first there was no time, then there was no suitable glass, and later it became somehow not up to it. It all started imperceptibly, like a light draft from a crack that no one pays attention to. During the day, this window was just weird. At night, it turned black. Not just dark, but absolutely bottomless. As if there was no street, no air, not even the world behind it. Gromov came closer several times, felt the frame, checked the seal, but the glass always remained cold, like metal. Nothing appeared in the reflection, not even his own silhouette. One day, he brought a flashlight and shone the beam directly at the glass, but the light in it went out, as if it was being sucked in by the depth. After that, Gromov boarded up the window, explaining to his son that it was temporary, until spring. The boy nodded, but his eyes remained wary. At night, he said he could hear rustling sounds behind the wall, as if someone was walking around the room, even though everything was boarded up. Neighbors who lived on the floor below began to complain that quiet sounds could be heard from the Gromovs' apartment at night, either voices or the whistling of the wind, especially in the area of that window. Sometimes it seemed to them that someone was whispering very softly, like a child calling by name. The women from the next door were gossiping at the speaker, saying that the boy was awake, playing, maybe with an imaginary friend. It sounded almost harmless at the time. But one day in early April, when the snow had not yet cleared, and in the morning the windows were covered with frost, the boy disappeared. The disappearance happened at night. Gromov's wife woke up to a knock, as if someone had touched the door. My husband was asleep, tired after his shift. She went to check on her son and saw an empty bed. There was a toy on the floor, a wooden airplane split in half. The boards used to board up the window remained in place, but one glass was covered with a palm print. The mark was clear, as if left from the inside, and even the lines of the fingers could be seen. However, according to Gromov, no one opened the window. The police were called immediately. The examination was long, cold, and fruitless. The whole house was cleaned, the basement, the attic, the stairs, even the sewer. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints. The policeman in the leather raincoat stared at the black glass for a long time and asked, "Are you sure the child couldn't have gone out the window?" Grimoff just shook his head. He tried it himself, the glass wouldn't budge, and the boards were nailed from the inside. Then the investigator said quietly, "And you, have you looked out this window?" Grimoff did not answer. The next morning, the house was sealed, but the family returned a day later. There was nowhere to go, and no one could prove what had happened. Only the boy was never seen again. The house seemed to have changed since then. A heaviness settled in him, elusive, sticky. The air was damp, and even in summer there was a smell of earth. People started moving out, and those who stayed complained of nightmares, especially those whose windows faced the same side as the Grimoff's window. They said they could see a faint light from inside at night, even though the apartment had been empty for a long time. The light didn't look like a lamp or a candle. It was breathing, as if it were pulsing, as if it were alive. Then the watchman, an old man named Mikhailov, decided to check. He went up to the second floor late in the evening, when the transformers were already humming and everything around was frozen in an echoing silence. The apartment door was unlocked. It was dark inside, but the window, the one, was glowing from inside with a faint, pale glow, as if someone was standing behind the glass on the other side. Mikhailov did not dare to come close. He said later that he did not see himself in the reflection, but a room where a boy was standing against the wall, but not in the same way as in real life, motionless like in an old photograph where time stood still. After this incident, the house was sealed again. The paper on the doors turned yellow, and years later, no one remembered who exactly lived there. They just said, "There is a house in the village where they don't settle. A house where one window does not reflect the light." Sometimes, especially on moonless nights, passers-by noticed a faint movement in the black glass, as if someone was looking outside. Some claimed to have seen a face there, childish, pale, with empty eyes, but either fear or reason made them stay away. People walked on, accelerating their pace without turning around. Time passed. Generations changed, the village grew, new houses were built. The old house by the forest stood abandoned, embedded in the ground. In winter, it was covered with snow up to the windows, and in summer it was covered with nettles. Only that black glass didn't get cloudy, didn't crack, didn't get covered with dust. It remained smooth and deathly cold, as if time had no effect on it. It was said that an architectural student who was writing a diploma on post-war construction came there to paint. He didn't know where he was just looking for an old building. "I found this house, went in, put an easel in the hallway. Then someone saw his things, paints, brushes, but the student himself was no longer found. His drawing, which remained at the institute, depicted the facade of a house. Only in the boy's window there was not a reflection of the sky, but the face of the artist himself, but not alive, but as if from inside the glass, beyond the border. The house stood and waited. It was as if he was dragging out time like a thread, linking the years together. People tried to demolish it, but every time something got in the way. Sometimes the documents didn't match, sometimes the equipment broke down, sometimes the workers simply refused. They said you wouldn't pay that much money to go there. One crane operator even said that when he adjusted the boom, the cabin was suddenly filled with cold, and in the glass he saw not a reflection of the cabin, but a black corridor stretching into the void. After that, the construction site was shut down. Even teenagers didn't go there anymore. The house has become a legend, half forgotten but alive. The old-timers, remembering, crossed themselves and said, "This is the kind of house where the glass doesn't reflect." And the children, playing by the woods, sometimes said that they saw a faint light in the dark, as if someone was opening a window from the inside. And every time the wind passed through the wasteland, you could hear something whispering in the silence. Not loudly, not clearly, as if through a column of water, calling by name, but in someone else's voice. The house stood abandoned for almost 20 years. No one lived there, no one opened the windows, no one touched the doors. Only the wind and dust inhabited these rooms, settled on the walls, filled the cracks. But even through the years, there was still a sense of presence in him, as if someone continued to walk along the corridors, carefully rearranging their steps. avoiding the light. People passed by quickly without holding their gaze. Even the dogs, when they found themselves in a vacant lot, shrank, growled, and avoided the place. In the late 70s, the village began talking about reconstruction. The city was expanding, and new homes were needed. The old buildings had to be demolished and the territory cleared. Among them was the house where the Gromov family once lived. When officials took out the archival plans, it turned out that there were no records of the construction of this house in 1953. We found documents for neighboring buildings and communications, but it was this number, this site, that seemed to have dropped out of all registers. Only in one magazine, among the pencil notes, there was, "House number 17 is built on the old foundation of the hospital. The materials have been written off." No signature, no seal. The paper turned yellow, the ink blurred, and no one could tell exactly who wrote it. Demolition was assigned to a team of young workers from a neighboring area. None of them knew the legends. For them, it was just a dilapidated house. When they arrived there on the first day, everything looked familiar. Peeling walls, broken doors, debris, traces of bonfires. Only it was strangely quiet inside. Even the footsteps sounded muffled, as if the air itself was swallowing the sound. They found old beds and rusty tools in the basement, probably from the hospital. There are peeling inscriptions on the wall. Ward number 3, isolation ward. No one paid any attention to this. The work started in the morning. First they took out the trash, then they started to dismantle the roof. But when they reached the second floor, where the Gromov's apartment had once been, one of the workers, a guy named Lyosha, found a strange door. It was packed with boards, and there was a layer of dust on top, but there was a fresh palm print on one board, as if someone had touched it recently. Lyosha joked that, they say, ghosts are offended that their house is being destroyed, and tore off the board with a crowbar. Dust immediately rose in the air, but a window was revealed behind it. More precisely, the window itself. At first, no one noticed anything special. It's just that the glass is dark and cloudy. But when the sun moved, the rays reflected on the neighboring windows, and everyone saw that this glass reflected nothing. It was like it was eating up the light. Lyosha came closer and knocked on it. A soft, hollow sound like metal. He looked closer and said, "Listen, there's a room further down." The others laughed, but he didn't look away. Then he said softly, "It seems that someone is moving there." A minute later, Lyosha disappeared. Not immediately, not with noise, it just disappeared. He was standing by the window, and the next moment there was nothing nearby. The tools fell to the floor, and the glass suddenly turned completely black. The others rushed to the exit. Someone screamed. Someone jumped out through the stairs. When they ran back with the foreman, Lyosha was gone. Only there is a palm print on the floor, just like then, 20 years ago. The construction site was stopped. The police, firefighters, and someone from the architectural department arrived. Everyone was standing downstairs, looking at the house, not daring to enter. One of the old men, a local resident, said softly, "I warned you. This is that window. It doesn't reflect, it calls." A week later, the place became quiet again. The house was never touched. It was surrounded by a fence. A sign was put up, "Danger Zone. No entry allowed." But at night, someone saw a light on the second floor. Faint, flickering, as if someone was walking with a flashlight. A policeman on duty nearby later said that he heard a child's whisper, as if calling someone by name, "Lyosha." He swore that he heard it with his own ears, but did not go there again. Another 10 years have passed. The 90s came. Everything has changed, the country, the people, the habits. The house was rarely mentioned. The fence collapsed, and the sign was blown away. Teenagers began to wander inside. They were attracted to this place. Fear, mystery, the smell of old rot and dust. They said that everything inside was frozen, as if time had stopped. There was no furniture, just a dusty hallway and a room with a window. One of the panes remained black, completely impenetrable. When someone came too close to it, there was a slight ringing, as if from deep within. One guy, cheeky, touched the glass with his hand and immediately screamed. He said that it was icy, like ice, and seemed to pull inside. After that, he got sick, first with a cold, then with nightmares. He said he dreamed of a boy standing behind glass. A month later, the guy disappeared. So the story went round in a second round. People started whispering again. Someone saw a weak child's face appear in the window. Someone said that footsteps could be heard from there at night. The old men who remembered Grimoff shook their heads. It always happens that way when you worry about something that should be forgotten. In the 2000s, a local entrepreneur decided to buy a building site. The house interfered with the plan, but no one wanted to demolish it. Then he hired a private team, paid 3 times more. They came in the morning, and one of them, an elderly man, asked, "Why is it so cold in here?" It was sunny and hot in July, but inside the house the temperature seemed to drop. The air was still, and the dust hung thick. When they reached the second floor, the man stopped. There was a faint hum coming from the room with the window. Not a sound, but rather a vibration, as if a machine was working somewhere nearby. They opened the door. Everything was empty, just the window, black and smooth as oil. The man came up and touched the glass. For a moment it became transparent, and everyone saw that on the other side there was the same room, but with furniture, a bed, and toys. It's as if something that disappeared from here has been preserved there. A boy was standing in the corner, facing the wall. They managed to see him slowly turn around, and then the light went out. The man fell unconscious. The others dragged him outside. He came to himself an hour later and said, "He's there. Boy." He didn't leave. After that, the construction site was shut down forever. The house was officially declared an emergency and closed. Unofficially, they just forgot. Only occasionally did school children pass by, and if the sun was setting, you could see the black glass pulsating faintly, as if it were breathing. It was as if someone was moving inside, but this movement was too slow, almost imperceptible, as if the darkness itself was moving. In 2012, Elena Krivitskaya, a journalist from Moscow, came to the village and wrote a series of articles about abandoned places. She heard about the house by chance, from an old man at the bus stop, and decided it was just a local story. With a camera, a dictaphone, and a flashlight, she went there in the evening when the fog was already beginning. Everything looked ordinary. A rusty fence, weeds, peeling walls. But the closer she got, the more she felt the pressure, as if the air was thickening, becoming denser. Elena entered the house. There was a recording on the recorder later, the rustle of footsteps, the creak of floorboards, breathing. Then silence. Then a small, childish voice, barely audible. "Can you see me?" After these words, the recording stopped. The camera was found at the entrance. The last frame shows a room with a window. Elena's reflection was on the glass, but her face was alien, elongated, without eyes. They didn't find her. After that, the story hit the newspapers again. They wrote in different ways. Some about mysticism, some about radiation, some about mass psychosis. Scientists from the institute came, measured the level of the electromagnetic field, and tried to explain the anomaly. But the instruments were going crazy. The arrows were jumping, the batteries were running out, the recordings were disappearing. One physicist said, "This is not glass. This is the border." And he didn't explain anything else. Since then, the house has become an almost sacred place of fear. No one went in there. Even casual travelers avoided it. Sometimes someone would leave a toy or candy at the gate, as if in memory of the boy. In the morning, everything disappeared. Only once did one of the passers-by notice. On the windowsill outside the window lay the same toy, a wooden airplane, split in half, glued and neatly placed next to the palm print. The house was as motionless as ever, but now it seemed that someone was waiting in it, waiting for someone to look through the black glass again. After all, everyone who looked there remained on the other side. The house stood like a faded memory. New high-rise buildings and shops had already sprung up around, and an old wasteland covered the asphalt. But that brick shadow still stuck out like a splinter in the center. People are used to avoiding it. Even the children who came to the village for the first time instinctively crossed to the other side of the street, as if they felt that there was something in that place that should not be. At night, When the lanterns went out and the wind came from the forest, the house seemed to come to life. Faint movement could be discerned in the dark windows, but you could never tell for sure if it was a reflection or if someone was actually walking down the corridor. Officially, it was listed as an emergency facility to be demolished, but on paper everything was stuck, as it was decades ago. It was said that the archive files on the house had disappeared. Even the old blueprints were suddenly gone, as if someone had torn a page out of history. There was an empty space marked "No data" in their place. People in the administration waved it off. There's nothing there, just junk. But as soon as someone offered to actually demolish the building, the strangeness began. The contractor went to the hospital. The tractor burned down. The accounting department lost funds. The house seemed to repel any interference, like an organism repels a foreign body. In the early 2000s, local historian and former history teacher Nikolai Evgenievich Sokolov had an obsessive idea to figure out where the legend came from. He spent his whole life collecting stories about Moscow and the Moscow region, writing articles for the local newspaper, and now he has decided to take over this house. He found nothing in the archive except for one note in the pre-war hospital file. Patients complain about the window in ward number 7. It's not the street that's visible from the window, but the walls that look like mirrors. The paper dated back to 1914. The doctor's signature was unreadable. Sokolov couldn't get this phrase out of his head. He began to dig deeper. I found an old woman, a former nurse at that hospital, who miraculously lived to a ripe old age. She lived in another neighborhood, and I only managed to meet her once. When asked about the hospital, she was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "There was a window, yes. No one could close it. We called him the Eye of the Ward. It was said that the sick leave through him." When Sokolov asked what that meant, she replied, "They just disappeared, without traces. Then we would put the bed against the other wall." After that meeting, Sokolov returned to the village. The house was still there, crumbling, but alive. In the evening, he decided to go inside, armed with a flashlight and a notebook. The ground floor was cold, as if an ice shaft had been opened in the basement. He could hear water dripping in the hallway, but he couldn't find the source. The dust lay in an even layer, without footprints. On the second floor, the air became denser, and the lamp began to go out. When he entered the boy's former room, the light finally went out, as if someone had turned off the battery. He was standing in the dark and suddenly felt that someone was nearby. Not footsteps, not breathing, just a presence. As if a person were standing next to him, not touching, but filling the space with his silence. Sokolov turned on the flashlight. The light wavered, passed along the wall and stopped at the window. The glass was black, smooth, without a single crack. He came closer and noticed that there was no reflection, only the depth like thick water. It seemed to him that something bright was moving in that depth, like the reflection of a face. He took a step and suddenly saw the boy. He stood inside the glass, as if behind an aquarium, and looked directly at him. The face is expressionless. The eyes are like slits, too dark. Sokolov recoiled, fell, and the flashlight slipped from his hands. When he got up, the glass was just black again. That night, he left without locking the door. I couldn't sleep at home for a long time. The next morning, on the windowsill of his kitchen, there was a child's drawing of an airplane, drawn in blue pencil. The paper was old and yellowed. He lived alone. After that, Sokolov did not go to the house anymore, but began to study its history with renewed perseverance. It turned out from letters and archives that the hospital had been here since the end of the 19th century and treated mentally ill and hallucinatory people. Several patients disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The doctor in charge of the institution, named Umansky, conducted strange experiments. His notes have not been preserved, but in one medical newspaper in 1916 there was a note, "Drive W." He argues that human consciousness can be reflected in a different plane of existence with the help of mirror surfaces. A year later, the hospital was closed, and Umansky himself was declared missing. The more Sokolov read, the more clearly he realized that the window in the house was not just a physical object. It was part of something bigger, Perhaps an experiment. There may be mistakes. In his notes, the phrase was often repeated, "The window does not reflect, it lets in." He wrote it over and over again, as if trying to convince himself that he had found the formula. In the autumn of the same year Sokolov disappeared. His apartment was found locked, his belongings were in place, and his documents were on the table. There was a piece of paper on the wall directly opposite the window. On it was written in pencil, "It does not show a reflection, it shows the reverse side." Below is a window with a black frame. There was a streak of frost along the edge of the paper, even though the room was warm. After Sokolov's disappearance, rumors broke out in the village again. Someone claimed to have seen his figure at the house, standing in the window. Others said that sometimes an adult face appears in the window now, rather than a child's, as if someone had joined the boy. The locals started saying, "The house knows two people now." In the 2020s, the place became an internet legend. Fans of anomalies filmed videos, arranged streams from under the house. None of them stayed long. The cameras went dead, the phones went dead, and the sound recorded only silence. One blogger still went inside. On the air, he laughed, joked, and showed peeling walls. Then he said, "That's it, that window. Darkness is like oil. I'm going to knock now." He touched the glass, and the next second the image went blank, replaced by a marked screen like an old TV. On the audio track, they later found a phrase uttered in a child's voice. "He's here now." After that, the flow of interest dried up. The house was left alone. The authorities put up fencing and surveillance cameras, but they quickly stopped working. In the footage that was recorded, sometimes something like a silhouette appeared in the window, although the house was dark. People stopped discussing him out loud. They talked about him only in whispers, as if he were ill. Sometimes in the morning you could see a palm print on the windowsill, a small, childish one. Frost stood out on the glass in the cold, and the palm stood out especially clearly, as if from the inside. No one dared to erase it. It was said that if you run your hand over it, you will feel the cold that comes not from the outside, but on the contrary, from the depths. Last spring, local residents noticed that the window was no longer so dark. It became opaque, like smoky glass, and if you looked closely, you could see movement inside, like a whirlpool. It seemed that the very fabric of the glass was alive, shimmering, breathing. That night, a 9-year-old boy who was playing nearby disappeared in the village. No tracks were found, only his bike was standing by the fence. The tires were covered with frost, although the weather was warm. The house came alive again. The wind brought a strange low sound from under its roof, as if someone was whispering, and people began to notice that the windows of neighboring houses reflected its facade with a delay, as if the picture was slightly lagging behind, like in an old movie. Some claimed that they saw figures standing behind glass at night, but if you get closer, it's empty. Sometimes, on windless evenings, you could hear something ringing in the wasteland, like a soft bell or a blow on glass. The old people said, "It's a call," and no one remembered Engineer Gromov, his wife, and his son anymore. They all became a shadow, part of a legend. Only Dom remembered. He stood like a watchman at the border between two worlds, and the window was still waiting for those who dared to look. After all, those who look into it do not disappear. They simply move to the other side, where the reflection becomes the real one, and the real ones are the reflection. Sometimes it seems that the story chooses those who should continue it. The house stood there, forgotten, half buried in the past, but it was still calling for someone, as if his darkness knew exactly who to touch. So one day a young man named Artyom arrived in the village, a graduate student at the Department of Architecture who was working on a dissertation on the phenomenon of Soviet ghost houses that were not listed in the archives. He did not believe in mysticism, and considered all stories about strange places to be a psychic echo created by the story itself. It seemed to him that fear was just a trace of collective memory. But when he first saw that house, he realized that it wasn't just an old building. He arrived early on an October morning. The air was humid and smelled of rotting leaves and iron. The autumn sun broke through the haze, illuminating the roofs of new buildings, and only one house remained in shadow. Artyom noticed it right away, The bricks had darkened, the walls were overgrown with moss, but the shape was strangely regular, as if the house was not collapsing, but just waiting. He set up the camera, took the first pictures, and only then noticed that the window in the lens did not reflect light. The photo was just a black hole, smooth as a smear of mascara. Artyom decided to enter. The door gave way easily, even though it should have been locked. The interior smelled of damp wood and old metal. The corridors were narrow, the wallpaper was peeling, and the floor sagged underfoot. He turned on the flashlight and slowly climbed up to the second floor. It seemed that the house was breathing, quietly, slowly, as if through a dream. Sometimes it seemed to him that someone was walking somewhere above, but the sound did not come closer. He realized that the house was not empty. Not in the physical sense, it's just that something lives in him like a memory lives in forgotten things. When Artyom entered the room with the window, the light of the lantern suddenly dimmed. The glass was immediately noticeable. It wasn't just black. It was as if it consisted of depth without reflection, without glare. As he got closer, he noticed strange ripples, as if water was moving behind the glass. He turned on the camera and pointed the lens, but on the phone screen the window looked not like a plane, but like a corridor. There was a perspective inside, walls stretching into the distance, light in the distance, as if the room had an extension. Artyom froze. At first, I thought it was an optical illusion, perhaps a reflection of the back wall. But when he took a step to the side, the perspective didn't change. He looked again and suddenly saw a figure. In the depths, very far away, there was a boy. The one in short pants, barefoot, with empty eyes. He was looking straight at the camera. Artyom blinked, and the image wavered. When he lowered the phone, the boy was gone. But the room suddenly got colder. He took a step closer and felt a strange pressure in his temples, as if something was moving towards him behind the glass. A rumble rose from the depths. Not a sound, but a feeling as if someone was saying his name without words. Artyom heard a small, childish voice in his head. "Help!" He staggered back. The glass remained motionless, but now pale silhouettes appeared in it. Faces flashed by, adults, children, vague, as if you could see them through the water column. They moved slowly, like shadows in dreams. Artyom grabbed the camera and tried to take it off, but the lens malfunctioned. The screen was filled with noise, the picture was distorted. Then he realized that he had to leave. But the door through which he entered no longer opened. The panic came suddenly. The air became viscous, and the lantern was almost extinguished. He hit the door with his shoulder, and at that moment there was a light knock from behind, as if someone had touched the glass from the inside. He turned around and saw a child's palm print. A moment later, another one appeared on the glass, a larger one, an adult one. Both prints began to shift slowly, as if someone was tracing the border with their fingers. He didn't remember running out. I only remembered how I found myself on the street, trembling, with a camera in my hand. The recording stopped at the moment when he turns to the window. Then the screen turned white. After returning to Moscow, Artyom could not work for several days. There was that childish voice in his head. Sometimes at night he would wake up and see that the phone screen was turning on by itself. An image of a window appeared on it, still black and motionless. Once it seemed to him that he could see himself in the reflection. Only his face was distorted. His eyes were empty. He threw the phone into the water, but the next morning a folder with the name Reflection appeared on the laptop screen. There was one file inside, a video from that day. But now the recording didn't stop. He clicked play. The camera showed the room, the window as before. Then the image seemed to go deeper behind the glass. A corridor appeared. The light went off into the distance. And there, at the end, he saw himself. His back standing in front of the window. That was the end of the recording. After that, Artyom stopped leaving the house. Neighbors said that at night there was a strange ticking sound like footsteps coming from his apartment. A month later, the door was broken into. The apartment was empty. Only the computer screen glowed. A window, black, without a cursor, like an abyss. Meanwhile, new events began in the village. After Artyom's disappearance, Several students decided to investigate for the sake of a documentary. They found old mentions of Umansky Hospital, photos, letters. In one of the doctor's notes, the term spectral window was mentioned, not a mirror, not a projection, but a certain layer that connects the reflected reality with the observing one. Umansky wrote that reflection can be crossed if the boundary of perception is eliminated. It sounded like nonsense, but there was a signature at the bottom of the document. The experiment is completed. The sample is fixed. The students decided that it was about the window. In one letter from Umansky, addressed to a colleague, there was a strange phrase. We did not open the glass, but the side. Now the question is who will look first. They went to the house at night to film everything on camera. There were 3 of them. They entered cautiously, turned on the lights. The house greeted them with silence. On the 2nd floor, they found a room they knew about from the archives. The interior smelled of dust and something metallic. The window stood as before, flat and impenetrable. One of the students, Anton, came closer and aimed a laser beam at the glass. The light was absorbed instantly, as if the glass had eaten it. On the thermal imager, the screen showed a negative temperature of -40, although it was 10 degrees in the room. Anton said, "It looks like there's a vacuum." The second, grinning nervously, added, "Or hell." They were laughing, but it was strained. After a minute, the camera filming everything started to distort the sound. Then, on the recording, muffled breathing could be heard, as if the microphone was catching not them, but someone nearby. When Anton touched the glass with his finger, it trembled. Not much, like water in the wind. He pulled his hand away, but there was a mark on the glass. Then it suddenly became darker, and something like a face appeared from the depths. Indistinct, blurry, like in an old photograph. It opened its mouth, and then the lights went out. The others ran out, abandoning their equipment. On the recording found later, the last frames showed several figures appearing in the window, children, adults, and Artyom standing in the very center, looking out. A few weeks later, they decided to permanently isolate the house. The territory was blocked off, concrete blocks were installed. But at night, the guard heard a noise inside. He told me that he heard someone walking along the corridors. A lot of light, childish footsteps. Then I heard a voice, "You're watching." He didn't check, just left and didn't come back. By spring, the concrete began to crack. The walls were covered with a network of small cracks, and moisture was seeping through them. Faint patterns of frost appeared on the glass of the window, resembling human figures. At dawn, when the sun touched the facade, the glass suddenly flashed, as if reflecting an invisible flame, but no one saw it heating up. In the same spring, strange things began to happen in the village. People complained about dreams. They all dreamed of the same thing. A long corridor stretching into darkness, and at the end a window. There is light behind him, but when you get closer, you realize that the light is not coming from there, but from yourself. Then the dreams ended. Several people stopped waking up. The doctors wrote, "Cardiac arrest in a dream." A thin layer of frost was found on the wall in their rooms, although the heating was working. In the summer, an expedition from the Institute of Psychophysics officially arrived there to study the anomalous properties of old structures. Unofficially, to understand what kind of window it is, the group included Dr. Anastasia Melnikova, a specialist in the phenomenon of mirror perception. She had studied reflection theory for many years and knew that the human brain perceives mirrors not as a surface, but as a potential passage. When she first saw the glass, she said, "It's not a window. This is a mirror zero, the absolute limit of perception." They installed equipment, cameras, thermal imagers. Everything fixed the same thing. There is no reflection inside the glass, no temperature, no light. The instruments showed negative values, as if there was not a void behind the glass, but a negative space. In the infrared spectrum, vague shapes resembling human forms could be seen. One of the cameras recorded the movement. The figure approached the glass from the inside and disappeared. Melnikova was left alone that night. She was recording the readings and suddenly heard footsteps. Then a light, childish laugh. When I turned around, there was no one there. A thin crack appeared on the glass, like a smile. She came closer and saw her own face in the depths. Only her eyes were closed. A second later, the crack disappeared. She wrote in the log, "The window reacts to the view. It doesn't show a reflection until you believe it's alive." At dawn, when the team was about to leave, Melnikova said quietly, "It's not a curse. This is the rest of the experiment." Someone tried to make a mirror that shows not the reflection, but the reverse side of the soul. And it turned out, no one took her words seriously. A month later, her body was found in her own apartment. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. There is a child's palm print on the glass next to the body. Now the house was completely alone. It was surrounded by skyscrapers, parking lots, and asphalt. People tried not to look at him. But at night, especially when it was raining, the black window began to glow, dimly, like breathing in the dark. Sometimes shadows could be discerned in the light. They moved slowly, as if they were underwater. The old-timers said, "It's gotten stronger." And they added, "Now it remembers everyone." One winter, a passerby noticed a child at the fence. The boy was standing barefoot in the snow, looking at the house. When he was called, he turned around and said, "He's looking back." Then he ran, and no one could catch up with him. Footprints in the snow led to the house and ended at the wall. In the spring, the journalists reappeared. They wrote that the house would be demolished and a shopping mall would be built. But it didn't work out. Construction equipment could not drive up. Suddenly there were sinkholes under the ground became soft like a sponge. The crane fell through half as if into a swamp. The workers left and never returned. The house stood in the center of the new block like a frozen wound. And the window, the same one, has now become different. It was no longer completely black. Sometimes, at a certain hour, it became transparent, and inside you could see a nursery room like in old photographs. There was a drawing of an airplane on the wall. There's a toy on the windowsill. Only this room did not exist in reality. When someone came closer, she disappeared, and the glass became bottomless again. One day at dusk, a man passed by the house. He was old, gray-haired, with a cane, one of the last inhabitants of the old village. He used to live across the street when he was still a boy. Then, in 1953, he saw the police carrying out the body of a woman, the mother of a missing boy. She died shortly after her son disappeared. Now, after all these years, he stopped, looked at the house, and whispered, "You're still waiting, aren't you?" He took a step towards the window. It seemed to him that someone was moving inside. There is a faint light in the depths of the glass. He recognized the boy, the one. And next to him, a man who looked like himself, only younger. They were both looking directly at him. The old man realized that he was not looking at the reflection, but in the other direction, where everything remained the same. He stood for a while and left without looking back. In the morning, the neighbors found him in bed. The face is calm, the eyes are closed. There was a piece of glass on the bedside table, completely black, smooth, and cold. By the end of the year, the house was sealed up again. But those who passed by said that now two figures were visible outside the window, an adult and a child. Sometimes they stood against the wall, sometimes against the glass. And on rare nights, when the moon was reflected in puddles, people noticed a third shadow very far away, as if someone was approaching from inside. They say that if you get too close, you can hear a whisper. Not words, but breath. It's like it's calling my name. Not loud, not scary. He just calls out the names of those who should have returned long ago. Now no one doubted that this window did not reflect the world. Keeps him inside out. It is not empty. It is full of those who once looked into it. The house has become not a place, but a memory. His walls were no longer crumbling, as if they were being nourished by the shadow. Sometimes a strange glow appeared in the sky above him, as if a mirror was hanging in the air, reflecting something that was not there. And when someone passed by, especially those who didn't know the history, they sometimes stopped and looked out the window just out of curiosity. And each time one of them disappeared for a day or two. And when he came back, he spoke softly. "It's not dark in there. It's just the other way around." An old film found years later shows a house, taken at night. There's a light in the window. The camera zooms in, and the closer it gets, the clearer the faces become. Boy, man. And between them, a woman, barely discernible, like a reflection in water. All three of them look outside. Then the light goes out, and only the cameraman's own reflection remains. But his face suddenly dissolves, and behind him is an endless corridor that goes into black. The film ends with a whisper. It opened. The house is still standing. And people say that if you stand in front of a black window at exactly midnight, you can see how the glass becomes transparent. And then, for a moment, it reflects everything around it. Not the street, not the trees, but those who are watching. Only the faces are different, calm, empty, as if they have understood everything for a long time. They say that quiet breathing is heard at this moment. It's not scary, just a reminder that sometimes a reflection is not what you see, but what sees you. Sometimes a house just seems like a building, but there are some that become a vessel. They absorb everything: fear, pain, longing, memory. The air thickens in them. Time does not move, and every glass remembers the look. The house on the outskirts with a black window has become just such a vessel. By the time it was almost forgotten, it was no longer just a house. He became the border. It's been many years. The city has grown. Asphalt has covered the land where barracks and workshops once stood. The house was behind the fence of a new neighborhood, surrounded by parking lots and supermarkets. He is almost invisible from the road, but at night, if you walk along the tram tracks, you can see his silhouette dark, as if cut out of thin air. The light was no longer on in the window, but it's still there. Only a few people knew the story about him now: archivists, historians, and a few old people. There was one person among them, a writer who collected urban legends. His name was Mikhail. When he found out about this house, he decided to write a book, not about mysticism but about memory. It seemed to him that legends were the city's way of talking to the living. He believed that any cursed place contains real pain, but the language of this pain is incomprehensible to us. He arrived there in late autumn, when the leaves were already wet and rotten under his feet. The sky hung low, gray as ash. Mikhail put the old Zenit on a tripod and took several pictures of the facade. But the house looked different in the photos. The windows were empty except for one. That's the one. Came out too black on the film, as if the frame had been burned through. He went inside. The door creaked, and the smell of damp hit my face. There was a deep silence inside, broken only by a drop of water somewhere in the depths. Mikhail lit a lantern and began to climb. The steps complained under my feet. He stopped on the second floor. In front of him was that room, shabby but surprisingly clean. The dust did not fall on the windowsill, as if it had not been allowed there. He went to the window. The glass, as before, reflected no light. He raised his palm, and the cold burned him. It seemed that the glass was not just cold, but drew out heat. For a moment, it seemed to him that someone was touching the glass from the other side. Two, only a little later, as if belatedly. He took his hand away, but the mark remained, and another one, exactly the same, appeared from the inside. Mikhail froze. Then he took out a dictaphone and began to speak, trying to keep his voice steady. Day 1. The window does not reflect anything. The surface is completely black. Perhaps the composition of the glass or a special coating. But there is a feeling that this is not the surface, but the depth. He stopped. A soft rustle was heard in the silence. Then it was like a step. Mikhail turned around, but there was no one. When he looked at the window again, the outline of a room was already visible on the glass, just not the one he was standing in. There, behind the glass, the walls were whole, fresh, and white. On the windowsill was a child's toy, a wooden horse. He took a step closer. There was a boy standing in the back. That's the one. He was holding a toy in his hand and looking right at him. Mikhail picked up the dictaphone and said, "I see a child." Perhaps the visual effect of the lantern light. "No, he's moving." The boy raised his hand and put his palm against the glass. Mikhail involuntarily did the same. There was only a thin line between their fingers, and suddenly the glass was as soft as mercury. He felt a slight movement of air, as if a door had opened behind him. A voice sounded in my head, not a child's voice, not an adult's voice, just a voice. Take a look. Everything was gone. The room darkened. The light of the lantern went out. He was standing in absolute darkness, but he knew that the window in front of him was open. There was a faint light coming from the other side, and Mikhail stepped forward. He woke up in the same place, but the room was different. Clean, warm, and illuminated by daylight. There were children's drawings on the wall. Voices could be heard from the hallway. A woman's, a man's, a child's laughter. Mikhail went to the door. Behind her stood a family. A man, a woman, and a boy of about 6. They didn't notice him. He realized that he was seeing the past. It was the engineer's family. Everything looked alive, real. The boy was running around the room, holding the same toy in his hands. The woman was laughing and saying something, but no words could be heard. Then the light suddenly changed, as if someone had turned off the sun. Everything froze. The man went to the window and touched the glass. It turned black. The child froze, slowly turned around and said something Mikhail couldn't hear. Then darkness covered the room. He felt cold. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing on the other side, where the boy was. There was a window in front of him, only now he could see his own world through it. The room on the other side was old, dusty, with crumbling walls. There was a man standing in it, himself but different, pale, with empty eyes. The man was looking right at him, through the glass. Mikhail realized that he had become a part of the window. Everything he felt was a mirror image. Silence, breathing, whispering. He could hear someone outside saying his name. He tried to answer, but the sound wouldn't come out. It became dark inside, and then a lot of faces appeared. They stood side by side, silent, as if they were waiting. Among them he saw Artyom Melnikova, the man from the old photo, and the boy who was holding his hand. "Do you understand now?" he said without opening his mouth. Mikhail understood. The window is not a portal or a curse. It is a mirror that reflects not the outside, but the inside. It doesn't show the world. It shows what remains when a person ceases to be himself. Everyone who looked into it left a part there. A look, a memory, a shadow. And gradually the shadow replaced them. He tried to pull away, but it was too late. The world on the other side was melting away, turning into white noise. He felt himself disappearing, not with pain, but quietly, as his breath dissolved in the cold. In the spring of the same year, passers-by noticed that the house had changed again. There was a figure in the window now. Not a child or a woman, but a middle-aged man standing by the glass, holding a dictaphone in his hand. He looked tired but calm. Sometimes it seemed that his lips were moving, as if he was telling something. People passed by and turned away, but at night the window glowed with a soft light, similar to the reflection of the moon in the water. One photographer took a picture of it from the other shore and published it in the newspaper. It shows that the reflection of the window is not a house, but a long corridor stretching into the darkness. At the end, there are many figures standing motionless. No one has been able to explain how this is possible. A week later, the house was demolished. The excavators worked all night. When the wall with the window collapsed, the glass didn't break. It just disappeared. In its place was a smooth, dark slab of earth, cold as metal. They tried to dig it out, but the shovels broke, as if the ground would not accept contact. Then the site was filled with concrete and a parking lot was built on this spot. But a year later, the concrete began to darken. First in spots, then in a solid layer. On rainy nights, the surface became mirrored. It reflected not lanterns, but a faint glow from the depths. Decades later, the area was completely rebuilt. There is nothing left of the old village. But sometimes at night, residents hear a strange sound, as if someone is quietly tapping on the glass. Children say they see small handprints on the asphalt. No one gives it much thought until someone disappears without a trace. And each time, a wet spot remains at the place of disappearance. Black, smooth, as if someone had put a mirror to the ground. Sometimes, passing by, Someone notices in the reflection of the shop windows not their own face, but someone else's. Tired, empty, but somehow familiar. Someone turns away, someone goes further, but there are those who stop and look longer than necessary. They say this is how the window selects a new one. There is the last record of Mikhail. They found it in his notebook when they were sorting through the archive. The text is barely legible, written in uneven handwriting, but the meaning is clear. I get it. It is neither evil nor good. It's just a mirror where what we can't bring to life remains. A glance is a door, and if you look too long, the world on the other side becomes more real. Everything you see becomes you, and you are to them. The house is not scary. The only scary moment is when the glass looks back at you. Then you don't know which one of you is a reflection. The house is long gone now, but sometimes on rainy nights, the windows of some apartments suddenly turn dark, not reflecting, but absorbing light. People close the curtains, but even through the fabric they can feel someone looking back. Sometimes children say, "There's a boy waving his hand." The adults are laughing, and then they find palm prints on the glass. If you walk along the old street at night, where that house once stood, you can see a faint glow. It moves along the asphalt like a reflection of a streetlight, even though it's dark nearby. If you stop and look closely, you can make out the outline of the old window for a moment until you blink. And then, it seems, someone from the other side whispers softly, "Look at this."